10 years after Nathan Drake first graced the PlayStation 3, Uncharted is now a well-known commodity. It's easy to identify the ingredients that made the series stand out. Technical and graphical prowess, excellent comedic timing, and standout set pieces. The list goes on from here, and unfortunately for Sony Interactive Entertainment, at this stage it's likely even the most casual Uncharted player could finish it. Although these elements are still of course present in Lost Legacy, the novelty they once held has tarnished to an extent. Meanwhile, the gulf that once existed between Uncharted's strengths and those selfsame elements of its contemporaries has narrowed significantly. And, of note, intentionally according to SIE, who continue to follow a similar formula across many of Worldwide Studios' releases. Thus, Uncharted fans greeted the news of Nathan Drake's last hurrah in 2016 with a sigh of relief. And though Uncharted 4 had its shortcomings, it was nonetheless a fitting way to send Nate, Sully and Elena rope swinging, ledge climbing and optional conversationing off into the sunset. It was with trepidation, therefore, that many met the announcement of this standalone adventure. Would novelty wither completely in Lost Legacy? Would some newer creative leads at Naughty Dog successfully inject some fresh ideas into the series as Uncharted 4 attempted to do? And would these fresh-faced protagonists fill the void left behind? The positivity of the answers to these questions, unfortunately, falls somewhere in the middle. The Lost Legacy starts small, with a fairly intimate introduction to reintroduce an old face, and an accomplished first chapter to set the tone for a slightly more down-to-earth Uncharted. Indeed, Chapter 1 contains one of the more enjoyable, non-combat sequences we've ever seen in the series, as we follow Chloe to a rendezvous with her new partner. The player begins by navigating Chloe through a cramped and claustrophobic slum, wrapped in a distinctly horrific tone. Bombings rattle the rickety buildings, and the camera draws closer to the avatar for a more vulnerable and isolated feeling. Shouts and screams from residents crack the human silence, and the verticality and tight over-the-shoulder view can have players twisting around frantically to locate these perceived dangers in this war-torn ghetto. There's a palpable sense of danger and chaos that's extremely foreign to Uncharted in this short section, amplified by details like a spinning bicycle wheel that some child has abandoned hurriedly to escape, or worse, been forcibly removed from. Leaving this atmosphere behind, we transition to a more traditional stealth section that nonetheless captures quite faithfully the thrill of grasping a brief window of opportunity, whether to incapacitate a stray guard or slip by completely unnoticed, all on the way to a distinct goal or objective. This should be contrasted with Uncharted 4's non-linear open-world stealth emphasis that often entailed a slow, methodical, and ultimately dull elimination of large groups of enemies. Though it must be noted that this frustration in Uncharted 4 was often exacerbated by drawn-out preceding sections. It's fair to say, therefore, that The Lost Legacy begins with a lot of promise, and from this meeting, the tale moves forward, offering glory, treasure, and antiquity. As many would expect, characterization and acting is of an extremely high quality in Lost Legacy, yet at this stage, it's something that one can find themselves taking for granted, which is perhaps significant in itself. Many of the returning faces from the series fit their new role extremely well, perhaps better than in their original appearance, with one in particular stealing the show. Nonetheless, as the story winds on, it finds itself falling into the same cliches of lost cities, wrong experts, and familiar set pieces. Though thankfully, with fewer loose ends to tie up, Lost Legacy doesn't spend as much time as Uncharted 4 did, filling space with stale platforming segments to establish relationship continuity. With 9 chapters to play with, the main dynamic or relationship in Lost Legacy has plenty of time to grow over the course of the game satisfactorily, without sections overtly focused on it. This dedication to one pivotal relationship isn't the only feature that Lost Legacy borrows from Uncharted 4. Naughty Dog plows on with what are best described as open-world growing pains. Truth be told, there are many virtues to this constituent. In a game which relies heavily on globe-trotting from paradise to paradise, allowing the player to more fully assimilate to this lush, tropical environment is a persuasive addition. Furthermore, it also lends a very personal sense to exploration. Previously, treasure hunting involved the player poking down small, shallow avenues to find collectibles and inevitably butting up against the confines of the game world. In an open world environment, players feel like they're entailed more factors that contributed to them stumbling across an item of interest by employing a more organic and discerning sense of observation. Meanwhile, designers are given more room to implement minor puzzle elements that can be rewarding in themselves. Though elevated exploration and environmental authenticity are worthwhile elements, Lost Legacy's open world still leaves much to be desired, especially when jostling for mindshare in a year that gave players one of gaming's densest and most interactive open worlds, along with a genuine mechanism to allow players to follow their curiosity with marking systems and distinct landmarks. What Lost Legacy manages to accomplish here instead is to make some of the interactivity within its world a little less structured and a whole lot more realistic. However, the constraints of realism can present issues within Lost Legacy in certain instances. Though our protagonists are equipped with an admirably resilient 4x4, navigation, whether on foot or in vehicle, seems more cumbersome than should be necessary, especially with no sprint option available. Even if Lost Legacy's painstaking animation can succeed in smaller linear segments, it's questionable whether this philosophy is well tailored to the open world context at all. Admittedly, within an open world, this issue can likely be ameliorated by a more densely interactive environment. Yet, as it always has, the problem still pervades some of the more linear scenarios too, particularly the platforming sequences in which it remains extremely difficult to dispel the desire to have the character climb just a little faster. Ironically here, players' impatience causes them to make an action out of rhythm with the avatar, in this case mashing the climb button fruitlessly. This is the very definition of frustration within a game, when the player's input doesn't align with the avatar's action. And this is before crate fetching and boost giving are brought into the equation. This small digression aside, thankfully most of Lost Legacy's extended platforming segments are reserved for the most interesting spectacle, though it must be said there is a limit to the amount of times one can scale an ancient deity before the thrill wears off. Though realism plagues platforming and open world traversal, Lost Legacy's combat scenarios manage to circumvent this issue, a pitfall into which most of the shooter genre for years has fallen, including many of Lost Legacy's predecessors. Luckily, the majority of Lost Legacy's combat scenarios are smaller affairs, so the correspondingly compact combat arenas contain shorter routes for flanking maneuvers and numerous smaller pockets of high ground that can be scaled quickly to dispatch a threatening enemy sniper and act as a platform to initiate more isolated enemies. In these smaller arenas, both enemy placement and enemy AI can be quite aggressive, inspiring a philosophy of constant movement. Traversal options like the rope and a well-balanced difficulty in normal mode allow the player to make successful proactive and reactive movements to conquer these scenarios, which comprise the majority of Lost Legacy's combat segments. Smaller levels also equally facilitate open warfare and stealthy options, and often encourage a blend of the two, though stealth will never feel as rewarding in isolation. When stealth is broken, in contrast to Uncharted 4's larger scenarios, you are rarely pinned down from afar by hordes of enemies, causing combat to grind to a halt. Though Lost Legacy contains no sequences involving a mad dash to escape a treacherous scenario as there were in Uncharted 4, which were, aside from multiplayer, the most enjoyable implementation of Uncharted 4 and Lost Legacy's shared shooting mechanics, these smaller skirmishes still promote some of the movement and split-second decision-making that make these raw tools shine, in contrast to some of the steeper or wider Uncharted 4 scenarios where combat slowed to a crawl. Aside from its combat toolkit, there are a few notable newer mechanics that are worth re-mentioning or readdressing in Lost Legacy. First, it introduces a lockpick system predominantly used in a ho-hum manner to give access to treasures or interesting weaponry. Occasionally, however, the mechanic is utilised in dramatic sequences very successfully as a brief moment of panic to heighten the tension of an escape or stealth section. Short, hand-to-hand combat sequences with an antagonist also reappear. Though neither mechanically deep nor particularly challenging, the few times these brawls do occur add a splash of welcome variety to gameplay, whilst simultaneously conveying a raw physical power and sheer force of person to the antagonist. Rather than playing out as quick-time events as in the original trilogy, these fisticuffs allow the player to interact with the antagonist with a very immediate sense of threat, where decision-making, timing, and positioning are crucial. Not just timing as with a straightforward quick-time event. Finally, the rope swinging mechanic is also utilised with just a little more gusto than in Uncharted 4, though only in a few select instances. Once to solve a minor in-world puzzle, once in a new welcome idea in platforming, and thankfully in one of the most climactic and enjoyable segments of the game's ending. Though this mechanic added variety to combat and platforming in Uncharted 4, it always felt like the rope was an underexplored mechanic. Lost Legacy seems to push that boat out just a little further. One of the more consistently successful features of Lost Legacy is puzzle solving. Uncharted has, for a long time, provided fascinating and spectacular ways to implement puzzle gameplay sequences, and Lost Legacy is no exception. Though, like a lot of Lost Legacy, long-time players may recognise the appearance of certain puzzle ideas, a game like Uncharted should rely quite heavily on gameplay variety that is thematically appropriate, and Lost Legacy's puzzles do more than enough to pull their weight by supplying their fair share of antediluvian intrigue. Apart from a few select technical hiccups on the base PlayStation 4 system, Lost Legacy is just as refined, polished, and finely crafted as all of its predecessors. It goes without saying that this is extremely welcome, yet there were many ways in which Lost Legacy promised to break away from tradition. A new female protagonist without a Drake in sight, a lower price point, and a more condensed story arc. This was an intriguing proposition even for those who feared a staleness creeping in. Unfortunately, it seems that most of these changes hold more promise on paper than in execution, and despite the few newer bells and whistles, that's to say the acceptable rather than remarkable open world, and the handful of mechanical additions, these simply aren't significant enough to revitalise the formula. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy is a proficient action-adventure without ever being truly outstanding or sublimely novel. The saving grace, however, is that a proficient Naughty Dog is still quite formidable.
Alright, Nate, just pretend for a minute that I don't really care about any of that stuff and cut to the chase, would you?
Man only interested in the climax. He must be a real hit with the ladies.
Never had any complaints.